many years. We're eating, I think, 17% less meat over the last 10 years was reported recently. So this is, Edinburgh adopting a plant-based treaty we think is a fantastic move, but it
What about
really is just
choice,
echoing
though?
trends already.
Yeah, isn't it the choice issue that many people are taking issue with here? You might think it's great and have no problem with a vegan or a vegetarian diet. You might sometimes even opt for that in a menu. I mean, more of us do that than we ever did, even if you're not a vegetarian or a vegan. But it'd be quite nice to have the choice, wouldn't it? Rather than some councillors deciding you can no longer have chicken.
Well, I mean, we already have a choice, and I think you've got to look at Edinburgh's plant-based treaty. It's a non-binding treaty. It's a direction of travel rather than tomorrow everywhere in Edinburgh will be vegan. So there's still going to be choice for a number of years. But to be honest, we're facing a climate change crisis. We're facing a biodiversity crisis. We're facing huge shocks in our food supply and huge rising costs. And I'm a great believer in that plant-based diet can be one key part of an overall solution to all three of those aspects. And actually, we can bring farmers with us. I'm always at pains to say the Vegetarian Society is an incredibly pro-farming organisation. How could I not be? Most of what I eat comes from the farm. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in working with livestock farmers to help them transition into a different mode of producing food, which happens to be plant-based.
Well, let's put that to David Beam, Parliament and Government Relations Manager at the Countryside Alliance. I mean, there it is, David. That's an open invite. They're about working more with organisations such as yourself and farmers.
Well, good afternoon, Ian. And I think that you summed up the general scenario quite well in your introduction there, where you pointed out that 1 week before Burns Night, it seems that Edinburgh City Council is looking to take an action which would end in banning the haggis. Given that
That's the headline here, isn't it? The haggis has been banned. Well, if you're in hospital.
Well, this is the trouble, you see, because if you look at what this treaty is trying to accomplish, most of the actions within it aren't actually within the purview of Edinburgh City Council in any case. So you really see that in fact there's a lot of virtue signalling going on in the case of what Edinburgh City Council has decided to try to do, and what they can actually implement. Well, there's quite a gulf there, shall we say. As far as the general issue, though, of wanting to transition to plant-based diets is concerned, I mean, it's been pointed out that meat consumption is dropping, but I think that you will find that is largely as a result of people deciding to take healthier choices and to balance out their own individual diets in a more sustainable way. And I have absolutely no problem with that. What I think, though, is that when you start to consider the idea of banning meat in its entirety, then you run into a lot of trouble when it comes both to personal health and also to having a sustainable and well-functioning farming sector in the overall scenario.
What about the points that Richard was making, though, in terms of, sustainability, the environmental arguments that are becoming more and more that we're reading about of late? Do they tip it for you, David? Is this the natural direction of travel for the human palate?
I think the problem with a lot of those arguments is that they tend to lead on global statistics, and what they're not considering is that we in the UK have a far more sustainable livestock farming sector than the world as a whole does. In fact, it's reasonable to say that the UK has probably the most sustainable livestock farming sector that you're going to find anywhere. So, you could, with a stroke of a pen tomorrow, ban any livestock farming from occurring in the UK. And what would happen is you would worsen the environmental consequences, because you wouldn't, by doing that, immediately manage to reduce demand. All you would end up doing is substituting lower quality, lower environmental standard imports for the high quality, high standard domestic production that we're doing at the moment.
Is that fair, Richard?
UK farming is in some ways defined as more sustainable, but it's still responsible for around 11% of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, and indeed almost 50% of methane emissions rather. Methane is around 30 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and so I don't think it's fair to suggest that somehow the UK's model is in any way sustainable, particularly when we've got some of the worst biodiversity in the world. We're ranked in the bottom 10% of countries globally for our biodiversity. A lot of that, down to our farming practices. 71% of the UK is farmed land. And there's a huge opportunity. I think if there's a number of studies that suggest if we stopped feeding the crops that we grow on arable land to animals and fed them to ourselves instead, we could actually feed the entire population with enough calories to be healthy. Well, there are studies that suggest that, and this is the point of these conversations, I think, rather than sort of batting facts and factoids back and forwards like tennis players. It's, I'm really keen to talk to David and to get, to have a discussion to get these things going, because I think there's no point butting heads all the time. I'm really interested in the role of farmers. I'm really interested in the transition from livestock farming. We will come at it from different
Sure.
ends of the spectrum, no doubt. Just to pick up the health bit, it's not fair to say that plant-based diet is less healthy. A number of studies that have been going, longitudinal studies since the 90s, that demonstrate that people who live on a plant-based diet actually have lower rates of diabetes, lower incidence of cancer, lower rates of heart disease, all of which are pushing huge costs onto our NHS. And so actually adopting a plant-based diet could be part of a preventative healthcare strategy.
But what about, again, sorry to go back to that point of choice, Richard. I mean, I was intrigued of all these institutions. They talked about schools and hospitals, nursing homes, which it may well be that by definition people in nursing homes are of older years, of course, and they might not quite be on board with the whole vegetarian vegan thing in the same way. And, without sounding insensitive, you're in the winter, very much the winter of your life when you're in a nursing home. If your last meal can't be a bucket of Colonel Sanders' finest chook, then something's gone wrong with the world, hasn't it?
I don't think so, no. I think something's probably gone right with the world, in my opinion, to be honest. I mean, we slaughter billions of animals worldwide to have this choice that we like to think about. Those animals don't get a choice. And I think if you look at the number of meat substitutes that are coming online, there's which will get better all the time. If you think 5 years ago, there were no plant-based aisles in supermarkets. There are now.
True.
In 5 years' time, what will it look like in 10 years' time?
And David Bean,
I think you may be able to have what feels like meat. It's just coming from plants.
Yeah, and I was going to say, David, is there a part of you at all that thinks, you might be, at some point edging towards that transition yourself? Would you consider a vegetarian or a vegan diet, despite you being a countryside man?
Well, my partner is a vegetarian. I think
you're halfway there already, surely.
Yes, well, I think coming from a view of animal welfare that probably more closely aligns with Richard's than my own. But even she thinks that initiatives such as what prompted this discussion today are nonsense, because fundamentally this has to be an issue of choice. Now, you asked Richard a few moments ago whether if somebody was on their last days, they were denied the opportunity to eat meat, whether that would be a good thing or not. And he said, well, actually, he thought it would be. But the trouble is, it's not some remote power that you need to convince here. It's the individual. It's their choice. It's their decision. And I think these attempts that we're seeing from the militant vegan activists who try to go over the heads of individual people and make decisions for them, well, that's what I have the most problem with. I don't agree by any means that there is a fundamental problem of sustainability when it comes to diets that include meat versus those that are strictly plant-based. And I think that there are a great many examples that we can raise of cases where including meat in a diet is actually far more sustainable than leaning strictly on vegetation. I mean, for example, when you compare the production costs of a product such as quinoa, the deforestation that has caused out in the developing world, particularly in Bolivia, with a situation where people might potentially look to substitute calories they might have got from those with sustainably harvest venison, a creature that has populations in this country that are running wild, you will find no comparison in terms of the sustainability of those diets. And it's not in, I'm afraid to say, the plant-based diet's favor.
All right, listen, on that point, Richard, did you want to get a final word? We've only got 20
just
seconds.
Very quickly, most of the deforestation is as a result of cattle ranching and growing soya and other crops to feed to animals. So that's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is when we talk about choice, I think you have to qualify it by saying sustainable choice. The planet is in a mess, and we have to reduce our emissions by half by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050.
Okay. Richard, thank you. Richard McIlwain, Chief Executive of the Vegetarian Society UK. David Beam was the other voice, Parliament and Government Relations Manager at the Countryside Alliance. Over to you on this one. What I'm really interested in is speaking to you, if you went vegan or vegetarian, it was the last thing you ever thought you might do, and you're glad you did. Lines are open. This is Talk TV.